I always thought there was something wrong with me. For as long as I can remember, I was the girl who couldn't quite measure up. The disappointment. The almost but not quite daughter who showed promise but somehow managed to fumble every opportunity that came my way. At least, that's what my mother made sure I believed. Emma, honey, are you sure you want to wear that to the recital? I'm just trying to help. You know how easily you get overlooked. Sweetheart, I don't think applying to that school is realistic for someone with your abilities. I'm protecting you from disappointment. Oh, you got second place? Well, that's nice. Jennifer's daughter won first, but second is fine for you. These barbs, delivered with saccharine sweetness and your best interest at heart, were the backdrop of my childhood. Death by 1,000 cuts, each one so small that complaining made me seem oversensitive, ungrateful, dramatic. Each criticism came gift-wrapped in concern, making it impossible to reject without seeming like the villain in her carefully crafted narrative. I'm 32 now, and it was only 3 years ago that I discovered the breathtaking scope of her sabotage. The systematic, deliberate way she had been undermining me since before I could form complete sentences. The way she had been setting me up to fail so she could swoop in as the compassionate, long-suffering mother of a perpetual disappointment. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it all unraveled, the day I found the journals, the day the fog lifted and I finally saw the architect of my failures for who she truly was. And let me show you what happened after, how I meticulously planned and executed the most satisfying revenge against the woman who gave me life, only to spend the next 3 decades trying to suffocate it. My mother, Diane Winters, former beauty queen turned real estate agent, community volunteer, and according to anyone who's spent more than 5 minutes with her, just the most delightful woman. A woman who chairs charity galas while sipping champagne and gossiping about the less fortunate. A woman whose Instagram is filled with carefully curated photos of her beautiful life, and inspirational quotes about motherhood being the most important job in the world. What those photos don't show is the way she'd sabotage my dance costumes the night before performances, how she'd accidentally schedule important family events on days I had competitions, or how she'd forget to mail my college applications until after the deadlines had passed. What those perfectly filtered images don't reveal is the way she'd interrupt me whenever I received attention, the subtle negging of my appearance before important events to destroy my confidence, or how she'd tell my friends embarrassing stories about me that were complete fabrications. For years, I accepted her version of reality, that I was fundamentally flawed, perpetually one step behind, lucky to have a mother who loved me despite my many, many shortcomings. Until the day I helped her move some boxes to the attic. It was late October, just over 3 years ago. Mom had asked me to help her reorganize some storage spaces in the house where I grew up, the house she still lived in after Dad left when I was 18. He couldn't take it anymore, he said. Couldn't stand her controlling nature, her need to be the center of attention, her constant criticism. I remember feeling betrayed that he'd abandoned me with her, but now I understand. Sometimes survival means escape, even when it breaks your heart to leave someone behind. Emma, be careful with that box. Those are important memories. She snapped as I carried a heavy cardboard container up the narrow attic stairs. I've got it, Mom, I said, gritting my teeth. At 30, I was still being treated like an incompetent child. I placed the box on the dusty floor near a stack of similar containers, all neatly labeled in my mother's perfect handwriting. Christmas decorations. Tax records 2010 to 2015. Emma's school projects. That last one caught my eye. I hadn't seen my old school projects in years. A wave of nostalgia hit me, and I found myself removing the lid while Mom was busy directing my placement of other boxes from the bottom of the stairs. But what I found wasn't school projects at all. Inside were dozens of spiral notebooks, all dated, all bearing my mother's handwriting. I pulled one out, opened to a random page, and felt my blood turn to ice. October 15, 2001, Emma was invited to join the advanced placement program today. Told her teacher she probably couldn't handle the workload and that Emma struggles with anxiety under pressure. Suggested the regular track would be better for her self-esteem. Crisis averted. I was 13 in 2001. I remembered being disappointed when I wasn't selected for the advanced program despite my good grades. Mom had comforted me, telling me those programs were overrated anyway, that they pushed kids too hard. My hands trembling, I opened another journal, this one from my high school years. March 3, 2006, Emma received a letter from the Summer Arts program in New York. Told her it got lost in the mail until after the deposit deadline. She cried for hours. Exhausting but necessary. That kind of program would only set her up for disappointment in the long run. I remembered that too. How devastated I'd been to miss that opportunity. How I'd believed it was just bad luck with the mail. Emma, what's taking so long up there? I quickly shoved the journal back and replaced the lid, my heart hammering against my ribs. Nothing, just got distracted. Coming! That night, after making excuses about forgetting something in the attic, I returned to my mother's house with my own key. I knew she would be at her weekly bridge game, the one thing in her schedule that never changed. I snuck up to the attic and retrieved the box of journals, loading them into my car before driving back to my apartment across town. Until dawn, I read, journal after journal, year after year of deliberate sabotage. Opportunities intercepted, achievements undermined, relationships with friends and boyfriends subtly poisoned, all meticulously documented in her elegant handwriting, as if she was proud of these accomplishments. When the morning light crept through my blinds, I was a different person. The fog of self-doubt that had clouded my entire life had lifted, replaced by a clarity so sharp it was almost painful. Every failure, every disappointment, every almost in my life suddenly made perfect sense. I wasn't broken. I was broken down, systematically, deliberately, by the one person who was supposed to protect me from the world's cruelty. I called in sick to work, my underwhelming job as an administrative assistant at a marketing firm, a position far below my capabilities but exactly what my mother had convinced me I deserved. I spent the day alternating between sobbing uncontrollably and sitting in stunned silence, the journals spread around me like the debris of a psychological crime scene. In one particularly chilling entry from when I was 16, she wrote about how she'd contacted a boy I had a crush on, pretending to be me, sending embarrassing messages that ensured he'd never ask me out. Emma's too young to be distracted by dating, she'd written. Besides, Jason is clearly going to be successful. He'd realize how ordinary she is eventually. Ordinary. That word appeared in her journals with devastating frequency. My mother, the former beauty queen who'd never quite made it to the national level, who'd given up her promising future to marry my father and have me, had decided early on that I needed to be kept ordinary. Any spark of exceptionalism had to be extinguished before it could outshine her fading glow. When my phone rang that evening, her name lighting up my screen, I felt something crack inside me. Not my heart. That had been shattered by what I'd read. No, this was different. This was the breaking of whatever had kept me tethered to her twisted version of reality for 3 decades. I declined the call. She tried again. And again. Then the text started. Emma, is everything okay? You didn't come back last night to finish helping me. Are you really sick or are you avoiding me? I'm getting worried. This isn't like you to be so inconsiderate. Each message was a masterclass in manipulation, designed to provoke guilt, concern, then shame, in that precise order. A pattern I now recognized with sickening clarity. I turned off my phone and curled up on my couch, trying to process 30 years of lies, trying to separate what was real about myself from what she had programmed me to believe. The next morning, I forced myself to shower, to eat, to resume some semblance of normal life while carrying this devastating new knowledge. I went to work, smiled at colleagues, completed tasks on autopilot. But inside, a storm was brewing. You look like hell, said Megan, my cubicle neighbor and the closest thing I had to a friend at work. That bug must have really knocked you out yesterday. Something like that, I murmured, focusing on my computer screen. Well, the Jacobson presentation is today at 2. Martin wants everyone there, sick or not? I nodded absently, barely registering her words. The Jacobson account was our firm's biggest client, and the presentation had been in development for weeks. Under normal circumstances, I'd be anxious about making sure everything ran smoothly from an administrative standpoint. But on that day, such concerns seemed trivial. As I sat in the back of the conference room later that afternoon, watching our creative team present their campaign ideas, something unexpected happened. When Martin, our director, asked for feedback from the client, I found myself raising my hand. I actually have a thought, I heard myself say. The room fell silent. Emma Winters, the quiet admin who took notes and arranged coffee, volunteering an opinion during a major client presentation? Even I was shocked by my audacity. The campaign is solid, I continued, unable to stop now that I'd started, but I think it's missing a key emotional trigger for the demographic you're targeting. Women in their 40s don't just want efficiency in a household product, they want recognition for the invisible labor they perform. If we reframe the messaging to acknowledge that reality rather than just promising to make their work easier, I think the response would be much stronger. More silence. Then Mr. Jacobson, a man in his 60s who rarely smiled, leaned forward. "That's actually insightful. Who are you again?" "Emma Winters. I'm an administrative assistant here." "Well, Ms. Winters, you've got good instincts. Martin, your team should explore that angle." After the meeting, Martin cornered me in the hallway. "Where did that come from? You've never mentioned having an interest in campaign development." I shrugged, feeling a strange new confidence. "I notice things. I just never thought my observations mattered." "Well, they mattered to Jacobson. Would you be interested in working with the creative team on revising this campaign? We could use that perspective. Would I be interested in stepping beyond the limitations I'd accepted for myself? In proving that I was more than the ordinary person my mother had convinced me I was?" "Yes," I said firmly. "I would." That night, my mother showed up at my apartment unannounced. I should have expected it. Her usual response when I attempted any form of boundary setting was to bulldoze right through it. "Emma, I've been worried sick," she exclaimed when I reluctantly opened the door. She brushed past me into my living room, her designer perfume leaving a cloying trail. "You haven't been answering my calls or texts?" I thought something terrible had happened. I stood by the door, hands clenched at my sides. "I've been busy," she scoffed, surveying my modest apartment with poorly disguised disdain. "Too busy to respond to your mother? What could possibly keep you that occupied? Trouble at that little job of yours?" Little job, one of her favorite diminutives for my career, my home, my life, making everything about me seem small, insignificant. "Actually," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice, "I might be moving into a new role. The creative team wants my input on a major campaign." She blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Then her expression shifted to one I knew well, sympathetic concern masking something darker. "Oh, honey, are you sure that's a good idea? You've always been more of a behind-the-scenes person. All that pressure and expectation. I just don't want to see you set yourself up for disappointment." There it was. The subtle undermining, the seed of doubt, the gentle reminder of my supposed limitations. A month ago, it would have worked. I would have second-guessed myself, probably called Martin the next day to decline the opportunity. But now, with the knowledge of her journals heavy in my mind, I saw the manipulation for what it was. "I think I'll manage," I replied coolly. Her eyes narrowed slightly. She wasn't used to this resistance. "Well, if you're sure. Though I've always thought your strengths lie elsewhere. Remember that creative writing class you took in college? Your professor was rather frank about your limitations in that area." Another knife, expertly twisted. Except now I knew the truth. I'd found entries in her journals about how she'd emailed my professors from a fake account, expressing concerns about my work, my ability to handle criticism, my emotional stability. "Did you come here for something specific, Mom?" "Because I have work to prepare for tomorrow." She looked genuinely startled by my dismissal. For a moment, I saw something flash in her eyes. Fear, perhaps. Fear that her control was slipping. "I just wanted to check on you," she recovered smoothly, "and to remind you about the charity gala next weekend. You promised you'd help me set up, remember?" I didn't remember making any such promise, but that was her way, inventing commitments I'd supposedly made, then making me feel guilty for forgetting them. I'll have to see if I can make it. Like I said, things at work are changing. She stayed for another 30 minutes, probing for weaknesses, trying to regain her footing. I remained polite, but distant, refusing to provide the emotional reactions she typically fed on. When she finally left, promising to check in on me tomorrow, I locked the door and leaned against it, exhausted but strangely exhilarated. This was the first boundary I'd ever successfully maintained with her, small but significant. Over the next few weeks, a pattern emerged. By day, I threw myself into my new responsibilities at work, discovering abilities and confidence I never knew I possessed. By night, I continued reading through her journals, documenting each instance of sabotage, each manipulation, each lie. The evidence mounted, a poisonous history that explained so much about who I had become and who I might have been without her interference. My mother, meanwhile, escalated her attempts to regain control. When I missed her charity gala to complete work on the Jacobson campaign, she showed up at my office with lunch, introducing herself to my colleagues as Emma's biggest supporter. She cornered Martin, telling him how worried She was that I was taking on too much responsibility given my history of anxiety. She began calling my neighbors when I didn't answer her calls, claiming she feared I might be in a bad place again. There was no again. I'd never had serious anxiety or mental health issues, except those induced by her constant gaslighting and undermining. But to the outside world, she was just a concerned mother looking out for her fragile daughter, the same role she'd been playing for 30 years. The breaking point came after the Jacobson campaign launched to significant success. Martin called me into his office on a Friday afternoon, a rare smile on his usually stern face. "Jacobson loved the revisions," he said. "Your emotional trigger insight was spot on. They've approved a budget increase for Phase 2, and they specifically asked for you to be involved." My heart soared. "Thank you for giving me the chance to contribute." "Actually, I'm doing more than that. I'd like to offer you a junior position on the creative team. It would mean a significant pay increase and a chance to develop that intuition of yours professionally. We'd need to backfill your admin role, of course, but I think this is a much better use of your talents." For a moment, I couldn't speak. This was exactly the kind of opportunity my mother had been preventing my entire life. A chance to step into the light, to be seen, to excel. I'd love that. I finally managed. Great. Let's make it official on Monday. We'll announce it at the team meeting. I floated out of the office, barely able to contain my excitement. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was breaking free of the narrative my mother had created for me. I was becoming someone new, or perhaps becoming the person I was always meant to be before she started chipping away at my potential. I decided to treat myself to dinner at a nice restaurant, something I rarely did because my mother had always emphasized how I needed to be careful with money, given my limited career prospects, another lie designed to keep me dependent on her. As I sat at the bar waiting for a table, sipping a glass of wine I would never have ordered a month ago, I felt my phone vibrate. A text from my mother. "Just heard the most disturbing news from your doctor. Reynolds. Call me immediately." Dr. Reynolds was my primary care physician, whom I'd seen for a routine physical just last week. My stomach dropped. Had something shown up in my blood work? Was I sick? I called her, pulse racing. "Mom? What's going on with Dr. Reynolds?" "Emma, finally!" I've been beside myself. "Doctor, Reynolds called me very concerned about your recent appointment." "What? Why would my doctor call you?" "I'm 30 years old." "Don't be naive, sweetheart. I'm still listed as your emergency contact. He said your blood pressure was concerning and that you reported significant work stress. He thinks you might be heading for a breakdown if you don't reduce your responsibilities immediately." Ice formed in my veins. This wasn't right. "Doctor, Reynolds had said my checkup was completely normal, and he certainly wouldn't call my mother to discuss my health. That would violate privacy laws." "I don't believe you," I said quietly. "Excuse me?" Her voice took on that dangerous edge I knew so well. "Doctor, Reynolds didn't call you." "That's a lie." "Emma Jean Winters, how dare you accuse me of lying when I'm just trying to protect you? I have always..." "Always what, Mom?" "Always sabotaged me? Always made sure I couldn't succeed? Always kept me small so you could feel big?" Silence on the other end. When she spoke again, her voice was deadly calm. "I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but this paranoia is exactly what Dr. Reynolds was concerned about. Perhaps we should discuss having you take a leave of absence from work." I could speak to Martin. "Don't you dare contact my boss," I hissed, drawing looks from nearby diners. "Don't call my doctor, don't talk to my neighbors, don't do anything. Just leave me alone." I hung up, hands shaking so badly I nearly knocked over my wine glass. This was a new low, even for her, inventing medical concerns to derail my career advancement. But it was also a mistake on her part, a lie too big, too verifiable, one I could use. That night, a plan began to form in my mind. Reading her journals had shown me the extent of her manipulation, but simply knowing about it wasn't enough. As long as she had access to my life, she would continue to sabotage me. And if I confronted her directly with the journals, she would deny everything, twist the narrative, make me seem unstable for misconstruing her maternal concern. No, I needed something more definitive. Something that would not only free me from her influence, but also ensure she could never do this to anyone else. Something that would expose her true nature to the community that adored her, the friends who envied her perfect motherhood, the charities that benefited from her seemingly selfless contributions. I needed revenge, not the hot, impulsive kind that would ultimately backfire, but something cold, methodical, and utterly devastating. something that would dismantle the carefully constructed image she'd built over decades. The next morning, I called Dr. Reynolds' office and scheduled an appointment. When I arrived, I was direct. "I need to know if you've spoken to my mother about my recent examination." The doctor looked confused. "Of course not. That would be a HIPAA violation. Why do you ask?" I explained the situation briefly, watching his expression shift from confusion to concern. "Ms. Winters, not only have I not spoken to your mother, but your examination showed you to be in excellent health. Your blood pressure was textbook perfect. Can I get a copy of my records from that visit? And a signed statement confirming that no information was shared with any third parties?" He hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Of course. I'll have my nurse prepare that for you now." Armed with this evidence, I began to build my case. I requested copies of all my medical records from childhood to present, discovering in the process numerous instances where treatments or evaluations had been initiated based solely on my mother's reports of symptoms I never actually experienced. I found documentation of anxiety issues and emotional instability that existed only in her descriptions to medical professionals. Next, I contacted my old high school and college, requesting transcripts and any records of communication with my parents. What I found confirmed more of her journal entries, emails from concerned parents, anonymous but clearly her, about my interactions with certain teachers, messages from her own account expressing worry about my ability to handle competitive programs. I created a secure email account and reached out to my father, whom I hadn't spoken to in years, not since my mother had convinced me he'd said cruel things about me during their divorce proceedings. Another lie I now suspected. "Dad, I need to know the truth about why you left and what Mom might have told you about me afterward. This is important. Emma." His response came within hours. "Emma, I've been waiting for this email for 12 years. Let's talk. Here's my number." Our conversation lasted 4 hours. He cried when I told him about finding the journals. He hadn't known about the systematic sabotage, but he'd suspected something wasn't right in the way she controlled my perception of myself. He'd tried to get custody during the divorce, but lost when my mother presented evidence of his emotional abuse, fabricated journal entries I'd supposedly written, documents he now realized were forgeries. After our call, he sent me copies of all the divorce proceedings, including the falsified evidence. Another piece of the puzzle, another weapon in my arsenal. Over the next 3 months, I maintained a careful facade with my mother. I answered her calls, though less promptly, deflected her attempts to interfere with my new position, and pretended not to notice when she, coincidentally, showed up at business lunches or professional events I attended. Meanwhile, I thrived at work, channeling my newfound clarity and anger into creative concepts that impressed both clients and colleagues. I began building a network separate from the connections my mother had always controlled. I opened new bank accounts at different institutions, ensuring she had no way to access my finances, something I discovered she'd been doing for years through emergency, access she'd convinced me to grant her. I also started seeing a therapist, Dr. Levine, who specialized in narcissistic abuse recovery. I showed her the journals, the medical records, the school communications. "What you're describing is a severe case of narcissistic personality disorder, with your mother as the perpetrator and you as the primary victim, Doctor," Levine explained during one session. "The level of documentation you've found is unusual. Most narcissists are careful not to create evidence of their manipulation. The fact that she kept detailed journals suggests she may see her sabotage as actual achievements. She's proud of what she did to me," I said, the realization like a punch to the gut. In her distorted reality, yes. She likely sees her actions as necessary protections rather than abuse. Confronting her directly probably won't yield the validation or closure you're looking for. "I don't want closure," I admitted. "I want justice. I want everyone to see who she really is." Dr. Levine regarded me carefully. "Exposure can be a powerful tool against narcissistic abuse. Just be sure your actions come from a place of healing rather than retribution. Revenge can sometimes keep you tethered to the abuser in unhealthy ways." But as I continued building my case, collecting evidence, and strengthening myself professionally and personally, I knew this wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my narrative, about becoming visible after a lifetime of being deliberately obscured. 6 months after finding the journals, I was ready. My plan had evolved from a vague desire for exposure into a precise, multi-stage strategy that would systematically dismantle every aspect of my mother's carefully constructed public image. Stage 1 began on a Sunday morning when I knew my mother would be at church, St. Mark's Episcopal, where she'd been a pillar of the community for decades, serving on committees and organizing charity drives. The place where her reputation as a selfless, devoted mother was perhaps strongest. I'd made an appointment with Reverend Patterson, telling his secretary it was a sensitive family matter I needed guidance on. The elderly Reverend welcomed me into his office with a warm smile. "Emma, it's good to see you. Your mother speaks of you often." "I'm sure she does," I thought bitterly. I wondered what version of me she presented to her church friends, the fragile, incompetent daughter who needed her constant intervention, no doubt. "Thank you for meeting with me, Reverend. What I have to discuss is difficult and private." "Of course, my dear. This is a safe space." I took a deep breath and placed a folder on his desk. "These are copies of journals my mother has kept since I was a child. Before you read them, I want you to know I'm not sharing these out of malice. I'm sharing them because I've recently discovered that my entire life has been shaped by systematic psychological abuse, and I'm concerned about my mother's involvement with vulnerable people through church outreach programs." His expression grew serious as he opened the folder and began to read. I'd selected entries strategically, the ones that showed the most calculated manipulation, the ones where she'd expressed satisfaction at my failures or distress. I included copies of the medical records and school communications that corroborated specific journal entries. After 20 minutes of silence, broken only by the occasional sharp intake of breath from the Reverend, he looked up, his face ashen. "Emma, I hardly know what to say. These are deeply disturbing. I know. I've been in therapy processing all this. But my concern goes beyond my own experience. My mother is the head of the youth mentorship program here. She has access to vulnerable teenagers, and I'm worried about the influence she might have." It was a calculated approach, appealing to his duty to protect his congregation, rather than simply asking him to condemn my mother. I wasn't just seeking to damage her reputation. I was strategically removing her from positions where she could harm others. "Yes, of course. We'll need to address this immediately. With your permission, I'd like to bring this to the attention of the church council, confidentially at first. We'll need to remove her from youth programs pending a full review." "I understand. I also want you to know that I'm not asking the church to take sides in a family dispute. The evidence speaks for itself." He nodded gravely. "It certainly does. Emma, I'm so sorry you've experienced this. Your mother has presented such a different picture all these years. That's what makes narcissistic abuse so insidious, Reverend. The abuser creates a public persona that makes their victims seem unbelievable by comparison." I left the church feeling lighter than I had in months. Stage 1 was complete, removing her from positions of influence over vulnerable people. It wouldn't be public yet, but the quiet withdrawal of church responsibilities would be a significant blow to her status in the community. Stage 2 came the following week. My mother had been strangely subdued in her communications, which told me the church council had indeed spoken to her. She'd made a few vague references to misunderstandings and people jumping to conclusions, but hadn't directly confronted me. That was typical of her approach. Avoid direct accountability while quietly reshaping the narrative. For Stage 2, I focused on her professional life. My mother's real estate business depended heavily on her reputation as trustworthy and ethical. Her clients were primarily friends or acquaintances from her extensive social network, people who knew her as the charming, helpful Diane Winters who would find them the perfect home. What they didn't know was that she had a pattern of withholding information about property defects, pressuring clients into decisions that benefited her commission structure, and occasionally engaging in borderline unethical practices regarding disclosures. How did I know this? The journals, of course. She'd documented her creative, business approaches just as meticulously as she'd recorded her sabotage of my life. She'd even noted which clients she could manipulate based on their personalities or vulnerabilities. I compiled this information into a detailed report, attaching copies of the relevant journal entries. Then I sent it anonymously to the State Real Estate Commission and the Ethics Board of the National Association of Realtors. I also created a separate file with information specific to 3 recent clients who had purchased homes with serious undisclosed issues, facts my mother had admitted knowing about in her journals. I sent these clients anonymous emails with just enough information to prompt them to investigate further. Within 2 weeks, I heard through mutual acquaintances that my mother was facing multiple complaints and an ethics investigation. Her broker had placed her on administrative leave pending the outcome. The carefully constructed business persona was beginning to crumble. Stage 3 targeted her social standing directly. My mother was scheduled to chair the annual Spring Charity Gala, the biggest social event of the season in our small city. Planning had been underway for months, with my mother at the center of it all, choosing themes, selecting vendors, deciding who would receive invitations to the exclusive event. I had obtained copies of all the planning documents through a friend on the committee, someone who had always been kind to me despite my mother's attempts to isolate me socially. What I discovered was that my mother had been skimming from the donations, not large amounts that would be immediately noticeable, but small sums diverted to a separate account over years that added up to nearly $50,000. Again, her own records betrayed her. She'd kept meticulous notes of these diversions in a separate journal, justifying them as compensation for her volunteer time. This evidence I took directly to the charity's board president, Margaret Chen, a formidable woman who had never quite fallen under my mother's spell. I requested a confidential meeting, explained what I'd found, and provided copies of the relevant documents. Margaret's reaction was swift and decisive. My mother was removed as gala chair immediately, and the board began a forensic audit of all accounts she'd had access to. They didn't announce the reason publicly, yet, but the suddenness of her removal from such a high-profile position sent shockwaves through her social circle. 3 blows to the 3 pillars of her identity: church leader, successful businesswoman, philanthropic socialite. Each one strategically targeted, each one backed by her own words, her own documentation of her misdeeds. I wasn't spreading rumors or making accusations. I was simply ensuring her true nature was revealed through evidence she herself had created. My mother's response followed a predictable pattern. First came the confusion and attempts to contain the damage privately. She called emergency meetings with church leaders, approached her broker with explanations about misunderstandings, tried to convince the charity board that there was an innocent explanation for the financial discrepancies. When those efforts failed, she moved to the next phase, positioning herself as the victim. Suddenly, she was sharing vague social media posts about going through a difficult time and learning who your true friends are. She began telling anyone who would listen that she was being targeted and persecuted for unspecified reasons. Finally, as her carefully constructed world continued to collapse around her, she turned her focus to me, the true source of her problems, though she couldn't possibly know the extent of my involvement yet. The call came on a Tuesday evening as I was preparing dinner in my apartment. "What have you been saying about me?" Her voice was tight, controlled, but with an underlying fury I recognized all too well. "Hello to you too, Mom," I replied calmly, continuing to chop vegetables. "Don't play innocent with me. Reverend Patterson mentioned concerns that came from you. Then suddenly I'm removed from all my committee positions. Now the Real Estate Commission is investigating me, and Margaret has the audacity to question my financial management of the gala. This all started with you. Sounds like you're having a rough time," I said, surprised by my own composure. "But I'm not sure why you think I'm responsible for your professional and ethical issues. Because this started right after you found those stupid journals," she hissed, finally showing her hand. "Yes, I know you took them. I noticed they were missing the same day you suddenly started acting different. You had no right to read my private thoughts." So she knew I'd discovered her documentation of decades of psychological abuse and sabotage, and her primary concern was that I'd violated her privacy? The absurdity would have been laughable if it weren't so typical of her narcissism. "Your private thoughts included detailed records of how you deliberately sabotaged my education, my relationships, and my career opportunities," I said, keeping my voice even. "Forgive me if I don't feel particularly apologetic about bringing that information to light. Those journals were my way of processing my concerns about you. Any mother would worry about a child who needed so much guidance. I was trying to protect you from disappointment by ensuring I would fail, by intercepting opportunities, by lying to my teachers, my doctors, and my friends. That's not protection, Mom. That's abuse." The word hung in the air between us. Abuse. I'd never named it so directly to her before. "Abuse?" she sputtered. "How dare you? After everything I've done for you, all the sacrifices I've made." "What sacrifices exactly? Sacrificing my potential so you could feel superior? Sacrificing my independence so you could control me? Sacrificing my self-esteem so you could be the hero of every story? This is ridiculous. You're clearly unwell. I'm going to call Dr. Levine, my therapist. Good luck with that. She's the one who helped me understand what narcissistic parental abuse looks like. That stopped her cold. The knowledge that I had professional validation, that someone with authority was confirming my perspective rather than hers, was clearly unsettling. This conversation is over, she finally said. When you're ready to apologize and make amends for the damage you've done to my reputation, we can talk again. The line went dead. I stood in my kitchen, knife still in hand, and realized I was smiling. Not out of joy, but out of a strange satisfaction. For the first time in my life, I had spoken truth to her directly and hadn't crumbled under her manipulation. But I knew this was just the beginning of her counterattack. She would be scrambling now, trying to regain control of the narrative, attempting to paint me as unstable or vindictive. And while the evidence I'd provided to various authorities was damning, there was still a risk that her considerable charm and decades of reputation building could help her weather this storm. Which is why I had already prepared Stage 4, the final and most devastating phase of my plan. Over the next week, my mother launched a campaign to discredit me among family friends and distant relatives. She called my cousins with stories about my mental health crisis. She reached out to former teachers and neighbors, describing how worried she was about my paranoid delusions. She even contacted a few of my colleagues, expressing concern about my ability to handle my new responsibilities given my fragile emotional state. What she didn't know was that I had anticipated this exact response and had already spoken to key people in each of these groups. I hadn't shared all the details of her abuse, but I had prepared them for the possibility that she might reach out with concerning stories about me. I'd been careful not to villainize her directly, but instead had planted seeds of doubt about her reliability as a narrator. My mother and I are going through a difficult period. I'd told my cousins at a family gathering the previous month. She's been under a lot of stress with some professional issues, and it's affecting her perspective on things. If she says anything worrying about me, please take it with a grain of salt until you can speak to me directly. Similar conversations with others in my extended network had created a buffer zone around me, not impenetrable, but enough to make her smear campaign less effective than it might have been otherwise. Meanwhile, I was executing the final stage of my plan. I had compiled all the evidence, the journals, the corroborating documents, the testimonials from people who had witnessed her manipulation, into a comprehensive dossier. I included a detailed timeline of her abuse, specific examples of sabotage, and the pattern of her behavior over 3 decades. Then I sent copies to 3 carefully selected recipients. First, to Daniel Morton, an investigative journalist for our city's newspaper who had previously written exposés on corruption and abuse of power. I didn't ask him to publish anything, just to review the material and consider its news value, particularly given my mother's prominence in local real estate and philanthropy. Second, to Dr. Eleanor Richards, a nationally recognized psychologist specializing in narcissistic abuse who hosted a popular podcast on family dynamics. I included a letter explaining my situation and offered to discuss my experience as a case study, anonymously if necessary. Finally, to the Board of Helping Hands, a support organization for victims of psychological abuse, where my mother had recently applied to be a volunteer mentor. This was perhaps the most targeted strike, preventing her from accessing a new pool of vulnerable people while simultaneously exposing her history to those most qualified to recognize its severity. Within days, the dominoes began to fall. Daniel Morton contacted me requesting an interview. Dr. Richards invited me to be a guest on her podcast, and Helping Hands not only rejected my mother's volunteer application, but also reached out to similar organizations in the area with a confidential warning about her. The newspaper story broke first: prominent realtor and philanthropist accused of decades-long psychological abuse. The article was careful, balanced, and devastating in its methodical presentation of evidence. Morton had independently verified key claims and included statements from experts about the pattern of narcissistic parental abuse the journals revealed. My mother's remaining defenders fell silent when excerpts from her own journals were published. Her own words, her pride in sabotaging my college applications, her satisfaction when my relationships failed, her strategic undermining of my career prospects, were impossible to explain away as misunderstandings or maternal concern. The podcast interview aired a week later, with Dr. Richards providing professional context for the abuse I'd experienced. We discussed the long-term psychological impact of having a narcissistic parent, the process of discovery and recovery, and the difficult decision to publicly expose the abuse. Many victims never get the validation you've received through these journals. Dr. Richards noted during our conversation, the gaslighting is so effective that they spend their lives questioning their own perceptions and memories. The documentation you discovered is unusual and powerful. I still have moments of doubt, I admitted. 30 years of conditioning doesn't disappear overnight. That's completely normal. Recovery is a process, not an event. The important thing is that you've broken free of the false narrative she created about who you are and what you're capable of. By the time I appeared on the podcast, my mother had retreated from public life entirely. Her real estate license was suspended pending the ethics investigation. The charity had filed formal charges related to the misappropriated funds. Former clients were pursuing legal action over the undisclosed property issues. Most significantly, her carefully cultivated image as the perfect mother, the basis of her social standing and self-identity, had been irrevocably shattered. I didn't take pleasure in her downfall exactly. What I felt was more complex: relief that the truth was finally acknowledged, satisfaction that her ability to harm others was curtailed, and a profound sense of liberation from the narrative she had constructed around me. 1 year after finding the journals, I stood in front of the mirror in my new apartment in a different city. I barely recognized the woman looking back at me, not because my appearance had changed dramatically, but because the way I carried myself had transformed completely. My shoulders were straight, my gaze direct. I had been promoted twice at work after transferring to our company's larger office. I had made new friends who knew me as I truly was, not as the perpetual disappointment my mother had portrayed. I was dating someone who admired my ambition rather than finding it threatening. Most importantly, I was no longer haunted by the constant sense that I was somehow fundamentally flawed or incapable. The fog of self-doubt had lifted, revealing a landscape of possibilities I had never allowed myself to see before. My phone buzzed with a text from my father, who had re-entered my life and become a steady source of support. "Just checking in. Proud of you, kiddo." Such a simple message, but it brought tears to my eyes. Genuine pride, with no hidden agenda, no subtle undermining, no expectation of gratitude or obligation. As for my mother, I had minimal information about her current circumstances. After the public exposure, she had sold her house and moved to another state. According to distant relatives, she had reinvented herself there as a victim of an ungrateful daughter's vengeance, a narrative that would likely convince some people who didn't look too closely at the evidence. But her power over me was gone. The journals that had recorded her systematic destruction of my self-worth had become the instruments of my liberation. The very documentation she had kept as trophies of her successful manipulation had ultimately exposed the truth she had worked so hard to conceal. I had become who she had always feared I might be: confident, successful, independent. I had become, in many ways, who she wished she was, but could never be as long as she was consumed by the need to control and diminish others. That was the most meaningful revenge of all. Not the public exposure, not the professional consequences, not the social rejection she experienced. The true victory was in reclaiming my identity and potential from the wreckage of what she had tried to create. I am Emma Winters. Not the Emma she invented, the perpetual disappointment, the fragile, incapable daughter who needed her constant intervention. I am the Emma I was always meant to be. The Emma who was hidden beneath layers of deliberate sabotage and psychological abuse. The Emma who finally emerged when the truth was revealed. And that Emma is just getting started. It's been 3 years since I exposed my mother's decades of psychological warfare against me. 3 years of rebuilding, discovering, and sometimes still stumbling through the aftermath of narcissistic abuse. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but what they don't tell you is what happens after the plate is empty. The satisfaction of seeing justice served doesn't magically heal 30 years of calculated damage to your self-worth. The public vindication doesn't instantly rewire neural pathways shaped by decades of gaslighting. The removal of your abuser doesn't immediately fill the void where healthy love and support should have been. Recovery, I've learned, isn't a straight line. It's a jagged, messy spiral, sometimes circling back to old wounds just when you think you've moved beyond them, sometimes racing forward into unexpected growth. sometimes stalling in a holding pattern of uncertainty as you try to figure out who you are without the constraints that once defined you. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let me take you through what happened after my mother slunk away to reinvent herself in another state, after the newspaper articles stopped running, after the initial shock of exposure faded into the background noise of everyday life. Let me show you what revenge looks like once the adrenaline wears off and the real work begins. In the immediate aftermath of my mother's public unmasking, I experienced what my therapist, Dr. Levine, called a euphoric release. The weight of 30 years of gaslighting and manipulation had been lifted, and I felt impossibly light, invincible even. For the first few months, I rode that high like a surfer on the perfect wave, fearless, focused, unstoppable. At work, I continued to excel in my new creative role, bringing fresh perspectives that impressed both colleagues and clients. My previously untapped intuition about human psychology, ironically honed through decades of navigating my mother's manipulation, proved to be an unexpected professional asset. I could read a room, anticipate objections, and craft messages that resonated on an emotional level in ways my teammates couldn't quite match. "It's like you have a sixth sense about what motivates people," Martin said during my first annual review in my new position. "The Jacobson campaign was just the beginning. Everything you've touched this year has outperformed projections." He slid a document across the desk, a promotion offer to senior creative strategist, with a salary increase that made my eyes widen. "We don't usually advance people this quickly," he admitted, "but the results speak for themselves. The team responds to your leadership, clients request you specifically, and frankly, I'm tired of other agencies trying to poach you." I stared at the offer letter, momentarily speechless. In my old life, the one where my mother's voice constantly whispered about my limitations, I would have immediately questioned whether I deserved this, whether I could handle it, whether it was a mistake that would soon be discovered and corrected. Instead, I simply said, "Thank you. I accept." Martin grinned. I was prepared for a much longer persuasion speech. Glad we could keep this simple. As I left his office, I realized something had fundamentally shifted in how I received positive feedback. I no longer felt the need to deflect compliments or achievements with self-deprecation. I no longer waited for the other shoe to drop, for success to be revealed as a cruel joke or temporary mistake. I was beginning to believe in my own capabilities without the reflexive doubt my mother had installed as my operating system. This newfound professional confidence extended to my personal life as well. I had been dating Eric, an architect I'd met at a client event, for about 6 months. He was thoughtful, creative, and refreshingly straightforward, qualities I'd never been able to maintain in relationships before discovering my mother's sabotage. Previously, my romantic history had been a series of short-lived connections disrupted by my mother's interference or my own insecurities. I'd either chosen emotionally unavailable partners who reinforced my sense of unworthiness, or I'd sabotaged promising relationships before my mother could, a preemptive strike against the inevitable disappointment I'd been trained to expect. With Eric, things were different. I was different. I shared my story with him gradually, watching carefully for his reaction. Would he see me as damaged goods? Would he run from the complicated family history? Would he, like others before him, suggest that perhaps I was overreacting about my mother's behavior? Instead, he listened. Really listened, without trying to fix or minimize or explain away. When I showed him excerpts from the journals, something I'd only shared with a handful of people, his reaction was visceral. "Jesus, Emma. This is..." He trailed off, running a hand through his dark hair. "I can't even imagine growing up with this level of psychological warfare. The fact that you're as functional and compassionate as you are is nothing short of miraculous." It was the first time anyone had framed my survival as something extraordinary, rather than something that required explanation or apology. "It helps to have it validated," I admitted. "For so long, I thought I was crazy or oversensitive or just fundamentally flawed." "You're none of those things," he said firmly. "You're someone who endured incredible psychological abuse and still managed to build a life worth living. That's not just surviving, that's alchemy. Alchemy. The transformation of base elements into gold." I carried that word with me for weeks afterward, turning it over in my mind like a smooth stone, a talisman against doubt. But even as my professional and romantic life flourished, other aspects of recovery proved more challenging. Making and maintaining friendships, for instance, was a minefield of triggers and insecurities. My mother had systematically isolated me throughout my life, subtly poisoning potentially supportive relationships and ensuring that my social connections remained superficial or filtered through her control. As a result, I had developed defensive patterns that were hard to break, keeping people at arm's length, withholding vulnerability, constantly scanning for signs of betrayal or manipulation. "I want to invite you to join our book club," said Megan, my former cubicle neighbor who had become a genuine friend during my professional transition. "It's just 6 of us. We meet monthly, drink wine, occasionally discuss literature, but mostly just catch up on life. You'd fit right in." My immediate instinct was to decline with a polite excuse. Social gatherings had always been opportunities for my mother to showcase my inadequacies or co-opt attention. Even though she was now hundreds of miles away, the programming remained. "That sounds nice," I heard myself say instead, consciously pushing against the old reflex. "I'd like that." The first meeting was awkward, at least from my perspective. I monitored everything I said, analyzing how it might be perceived, waiting for the subtle shifts in expression that would indicate I'd somehow failed at basic social interaction. I left exhausted from the effort of appearing normal while maintaining vigilant self-awareness. "How was it, doctor?" Levine asked during our next therapy session. "Draining," I admitted. "I spent the whole time performing functional human who deserves friendship instead of just being present. That's a common experience for survivors of narcissistic abuse," she said. "Social situations become performances where you're both participant and critic, constantly evaluating how well you're meeting unspoken expectations. Will it always be this exhausting? No. With practice and positive experiences, those hypervigilant responses will diminish. The key is to keep showing up, to accumulate evidence that contradicts your mother's narrative about your social value." So I kept showing up, to book club, to happy hours with colleagues, to community events in my new neighborhood, and slowly, the performance aspect began to fade. I found myself genuinely enjoying conversations without the constant internal commentary. I began to trust that people might actually want me around for who I was, not out of obligation or pity. But just as I was finding my footing in this new, healthier version of life, the past reached out with familiar, manicured claws. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening when my phone rang with an unknown number from out of state. I normally would have let it go to voicemail, but I was expecting a call from a potential client in Chicago, so I answered without my usual caution. "Hello, is this Emma Winters?" The voice was unfamiliar, male, professional, with the slight formality of someone reading from a script. "Yes, this is Emma, Ms. Winters. My name is Andrew Palmer with the Herald Tribune. I'm working on a feature about family estrangement and reconciliation, and I understand you have a complex relationship with your mother, Diane Winters." My blood turned to ice. The Herald Tribune was a newspaper in Sarasota, Florida, where my mother had relocated after her public disgrace. "Who gave you my number?" I asked, my voice steady despite the adrenaline suddenly flooding my system. "I'm not at liberty to say, but I assure you, this piece aims to present balanced perspectives on family healing. Your mother has shared her journey of self-reflection and desire for reconciliation, and we'd like to include your voice as well." Of course she had. Of course my mother had found a new audience for her performance as the misunderstood, long-suffering parent yearning to reconnect with her ungrateful child. Of course she was trying to rewrite the narrative, to paint herself as the victim of my vindictiveness rather than the perpetrator of decades of abuse. And of course she had manipulated this unsuspecting reporter into becoming her unwitting proxy, a way to breach the no-contact boundary I had established. "Mr. Palmer," I said, summoning the professional tone I used in challenging client meetings, "I'm declining to comment on your story. However, I strongly encourage you to search for the investigative piece published in the Chronicle 3 years ago regarding Diane Winters. You might find it provides important context for the narrative she's presenting to you. I've seen references to some allegations," he said, hesitation evident in his voice. "But Ms. Winters has been very open about how those claims were misrepresented and taken out of context during a difficult period in her life." "They weren't allegations, Mr. Palmer. They were documented facts supported by extensive evidence, including journals in her own handwriting detailing decades of psychological abuse." Silence on the other end of the line. Then, "Would you be willing to share that documentation?" "The original materials are part of ongoing legal proceedings." I lied smoothly, "but the Chronicle article includes verified excerpts." I'd also suggest contacting Daniel Morton, the journalist who broke the original story. He still has copies of the evidence his team authenticated. More silence. I could almost hear the mental recalculation happening as the reporter realized he might have been manipulated into pursuing a story that was far different than what he'd been led to believe. "I appreciate your time, Miss Winters," he finally said. "I'll look into these additional sources before proceeding with the piece." After hanging up, I sat motionless on my couch, phone still clutched in my hand. The familiar cold dread that had been my constant companion for most of my life was creeping back, whispering that I would never truly be free, that my mother would always find ways to insinuate herself into my life, to undermine my truth, to rewrite history. I called Eric, hands shaking. "She's trying to make a comeback," I said when he answered, not bothering with a greeting. "She's found some local reporter to help rehabilitate her image. She's going to try to paint me as the villain again." "Breathe, Emma," he said, his voice steady. "Where are you right now?" "At home." "I'm coming over. We'll figure this out together. Just breathe until I get there." While waiting for Eric, I called Daniel Morton, the journalist who had broken the original story about my mother. We had maintained occasional contact as I worked through the legal aftermath of her financial misdeeds at the charity. "Emma," he greeted me warmly. "Good to hear from you. How are you doing?" I explained the situation, the knot in my stomach loosening slightly as I spoke to someone who knew the full truth, who had seen the evidence, who had helped expose my mother's abuse. "I'm not surprised she's trying this angle," Daniel said when I finished. "Narcissists are remarkably resilient in their self-delusion. When one narrative fails, they simply construct another that preserves their self-image and discredits their critics. What should I do? I don't want to get pulled into a public back and forth with her, but I can't let her rewrite history either." "Forward me the reporter's contact information," he said. "I'll reach out to him professionally, journalist to journalist. I still have all the documentation from our investigation, the journals, the corroborating evidence, the expert opinions. If this Palmer is any kind of ethical reporter, he'll reconsider the story once he sees the facts." By the time Eric arrived with takeout and a bottle of wine, I had moved from panic to a grim sort of resignation. We sat at my kitchen island, picking at pad thai while I recounted the conversation with Daniel. "Do you think it'll work?" Eric asked. "Will this reporter back off once he knows the truth?" "Maybe. But even if he does, she'll just find someone else. That's how she operates. When one path to control or attention gets blocked, she finds another." Eric was quiet for a moment, twisting his fork in the noodles. "Have you considered that this might actually be an opportunity?" I looked at him sharply. "An opportunity for what? More public drama? More emotional drain? More explaining myself to people who want to believe her poor mother act? An opportunity to reclaim the narrative completely," he said. "Right now, you're reacting to her moves, playing defense. What if you went on offense instead?" "What do you mean?" "You've been healing, growing, building a new life. You've become this incredible, resilient person with a thriving career and relationships based on authenticity rather than manipulation. Meanwhile, she's still stuck in the same patterns, just with a new audience." He leaned forward, eyes intent. "What if you wrote your own story? Not just the exposure of her abuse, but the full journey of recovery. The before, during, and especially the after. Show people not just what narcissistic abuse looks like, but what healing from it can be." I sat back, considering the idea. "Like a book? A book, a series of articles, a documentary, whatever format feels right. The point is, stop letting her define the story. Tell it yourself completely in your own words." The suggestion settled over me like a revelation. For 3 years, I had been focused on moving forward, on building a life separate from my mother's influence. I had exposed her abuse, yes, but I had never fully told my own story of survival and transformation. Perhaps it was time. The next morning, I called Dr. Richards, the psychologist who had featured me on her podcast about narcissistic abuse years earlier. Our initial interview had been focused primarily on exposing my mother's behavior. Now I wanted to discuss the recovery process in greater depth. "I've been thinking about expanding my story," I explained. "Not just documenting the abuse, but sharing the healing journey. Do you think that would be valuable for others in similar situations?" "Absolutely," she said without hesitation. "There are countless resources on identifying narcissistic abuse, but far fewer authentic accounts of the recovery process. The messy, non-linear reality of rebuilding a sense of self after narcissistic parenting is something many survivors struggle to find guidance on. I wouldn't want it to come across as vengeful or bitter. I said, voicing the concern that had immediately followed Eric's suggestion. The last thing I want is to perpetuate the cycle of toxicity. That's a legitimate concern, Doctor, Richards acknowledged. But from our previous conversations and what you're sharing now, it sounds like your motivation isn't vindictive. You're not trying to hurt your mother. You're trying to help others who've been hurt in similar ways. And maybe help myself in the process, I admitted. There's something appealing about having control over my own narrative for once. That's not just appealing, it's therapeutic. Narrative reconstruction is a powerful healing tool for trauma survivors. Telling your story, particularly in a way that emphasizes your agency and growth, can help integrate fragmented experiences into a cohesive sense of identity. Over the next few weeks, I began outlining my story in earnest. Not just the discovery of the journals and the subsequent exposure of my mother's abuse, but the complex, messy business of healing afterward. The panic attacks that still occasionally ambushed me in moments of stress. The dreams where I was still small and trapped in her web of criticism and control. The relationship patterns I was still working to unlearn, the victories, large and small, that marked my progress toward wholeness. I shared early drafts with Dr. Levine, who helped me identify blind spots and provided clinical context for my experiences. I discussed the project with Eric, who offered both emotional support and practical feedback on structure and clarity. I consulted with Daniel Morton about the potential public and personal impact of publishing such a deeply personal account. Through it all, I committed to radical honesty, not just about my mother's manipulation, but about my own complicity in maintaining the dysfunctional dynamic for so many years, about the ways I had internalized her criticisms and perpetuated them even in her absence, about the complicated grief of losing not just my relationship with my mother, but the fantasy that someday she might become the parent I needed her to be. Your willingness to examine your own role in the relationship is what distinguishes this from a simple revenge narrative, Dr. Levine noted during one of our sessions. You're not positioning yourself as a perfect victim or your mother as a cartoon villain. You're showing the complex humanity of both sides, even while maintaining clear boundaries about what was abusive. 6 months into the writing process, Daniel Morton contacted me with news. The Sarasota Herald-Tribune had indeed killed the reconciliation story after investigating my mother's history more thoroughly. But there was more. You might find this interesting, he said, forwarding an email chain. After I shared the evidence with Palmer, he did some local digging on your mother's current activities. Apparently, she's reinvented herself as a life coach, specializing in mother-daughter relationships. I stared at the screen, a cold weight settling in my stomach. My mother, whose psychological warfare had nearly destroyed my sense of self, was now positioning herself as an expert on healthy family dynamics. She was monetizing the very relationships she had poisoned, likely using distorted versions of our story to establish credibility with unsuspecting clients. She's found a new way to exploit our relationship, I said, the words bitter on my tongue. A new audience to manipulate with her version of events. Yes, but there's a potential silver lining, Daniel replied. Palmer discovered she's scheduled to speak at a women's empowerment conference next month, her first major public appearance in her new professional identity. The organizers almost certainly don't know about her history. I understood immediately what he was suggesting. You think I should make them aware? I think information wants to be free, he said carefully. Especially information that could prevent vulnerable people from being exploited by someone with a documented history of psychological abuse. That evening, I discussed the situation with Eric and my father, who had become my most trusted advisors. My father's perspective was particularly valuable. He had experienced my mother's manipulation firsthand during their marriage and subsequent divorce, yet he'd maintained a remarkable lack of bitterness. The question isn't whether exposing her new scheme is justified, my father said, his voice thoughtful over the speakerphone. The evidence speaks for itself on that count. The question is whether engaging with her in any way, even indirectly, serves your healing or hinders it. I've been wondering the same thing, I admitted. Part of me wants to protect potential victims from her manipulation, but another part knows that any action I take will be interpreted by her as evidence that I'm still emotionally entangled, still reacting to her rather than living my own life. There's no perfect answer here, Emma, Eric said, squeezing my hand. Either choice has potential consequences for your well-being. The question is which set of consequences you can best live with. I spent several days weighing the options, consulting with Dr. Levine, meditating on my true motivations. Was I considering this out of genuine concern for others, or was it a continuation of the revenge cycle? Was I acting from my highest self, or from the wounded child still seeking validation? In the end, I made my decision based on a simple principle: transparency without engagement. I compiled a factual, emotionally neutral document outlining my mother's documented history of psychological abuse, financial misconduct, and ethical violations. I attached copies of the original news articles, court records related to her misappropriation of charity funds, and statements from credible professionals who had reviewed the evidence. I didn't include personal commentary or pleas for action. I simply presented the facts and supporting documentation. Then I sent this packet to the organizers of the Women's Empowerment Conference with a brief cover letter. I believe in informed consent as the foundation of any professional relationship. The attached public records regarding Diane Winters may be relevant to your decision-making regarding speakers who influence vulnerable audiences. I am not requesting any specific action and do not wish to be contacted about this matter. I signed it simply with my name, then sealed the envelope and dropped it at the post office. No return address. No further involvement, just information released into the world to find its own path. 2 weeks later, my mother's name disappeared from the conference website. I felt no triumph, no vindication, just a quiet sense of having honored the truth without allowing it to consume me. Meanwhile, my own project continued to evolve. What had started as a potential book about narcissistic abuse recovery was expanding into something more comprehensive, a support framework for adult children of narcissistic parents that included not just my story, but resources, therapeutic techniques, and community-building elements. I partnered with Dr. Richards and 2 other mental health professionals specializing in narcissistic abuse to develop a multifaceted approach to recovery. We created online support groups, educational webinars, and practical tools for setting boundaries and rebuilding identity after narcissistic parenting. At the center of it all was my narrative, not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a guide who had walked the path and could illuminate the way for others still finding their footing in the darkness of aftermath. I never expected to become an advocate. I told Eric one evening as we reviewed the website design for what we were calling the Mirror Project. I just wanted to escape her influence and build my own life. Sometimes our deepest wounds become our most powerful offerings, he replied, echoing something Dr. Levine had once told me. You're not just healing yourself anymore. You're creating a map for others who are lost in the same wilderness you found your way through. The project launched on my 35th birthday, a symbolic reclaiming of a date that had previously been marked by my mother's ability to make even my celebration about her needs and narrative. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Emails flooded in from people who recognized their own experiences in my story, who felt validated and understood perhaps for the first time. "I've spent 40 years thinking I was crazy," wrote one woman. "My mother has convinced everyone in our family that I'm mentally unstable and ungrateful. Reading your story was like finding a key to a door I'd given up hope of ever opening. My narcissistic father used different tactics than your mother," wrote another correspondent, but the underlying pattern was identical. "The way you described the fog lifting when you found evidence of deliberate sabotage, I felt that in my bones." Each message reinforced what Eric and Dr. Richards had suggested months earlier. My story, in all its messy complexity, had value beyond my personal healing. It was serving as a beacon for others still trapped in the funhouse mirrors of narcissistic distortion. But with visibility came vulnerability. As the Mirror Project gained traction in mental health circles and survivor communities, it inevitably attracted my mother's attention as well. The email arrived on a Sunday morning, its subject line a deceptively simple, "From your mother." I stared at it in my inbox, heart racing, torn between deleting it unread and needing to know what new manipulation it contained. Eric, seeing my expression, crossed the kitchen where we'd been enjoying a lazy breakfast. "You don't have to open it," he said quietly. "You've been clear about your boundaries. No contact means no contact, even if it's uncomfortable not knowing what she's saying." He was right. Opening the email would be inviting her voice back into my hard-won mental freedom. Whatever it contained, threats, guilt, false apologies, demands, would serve her purpose, not mine. "I'm not going to read it," I decided, moving it to a folder labeled Documentation. Without opening it, I had created this folder early in my recovery as a place to store evidence of her attempts at contact without engaging with the content. If it's relevant legally, my lawyer can review it. Otherwise, it's just another attempt to breach my boundaries. Later that week, I received a cease and desist letter from an attorney representing my mother, claiming that the Mirror Project defamed her and caused emotional distress. Though I was not naming her directly in any of the public materials, she argued that people familiar with the earlier news stories could identify her as the narcissistic parent I described. My own attorney reviewed the letter and responded with a concise summary of the documented evidence supporting my account, the careful anonymization of identifying details in current materials, and the First Amendment protections covering my right to share my lived experience. "This is a nuisance filing," she assured me. "She has no legal ground to stand on, especially given the extensive documentation and the fact that you're not using her name in the new project. She's trying to intimidate you into silence. Will it go further?" I asked, anxious despite the reassurance. "Could this turn into an actual lawsuit?" "It's highly unlikely. Her attorney must know this is a losing battle. The discovery process alone would expose even more of her behavior to scrutiny. This is about power and control, not legal merit." She was right. No further legal action materialized, just as the threatened newspaper story had dissipated when confronted with facts. My mother was testing boundaries, looking for weak points, attempting to reassert control through intimidation. Finding none, she retreated, at least for the moment. As the Mirror Project grew, so did my professional trajectory. My insights into psychological manipulation and identity reconstruction proved valuable not just in marketing, but in corporate culture and leadership development. I was invited to speak at conferences, contribute to business publications, and eventually consult with organizations on creating environments resistant to narcissistic exploitation. My personal narrative, once a source of shame and confusion, had transformed into professional currency, not because I was trading on victim status, but because I had translated painful experience into useful wisdom. 5 years after discovering my mother's journals, I stood at a podium in a hotel ballroom, addressing a conference of mental health professionals on the long-term impacts of narcissistic parenting. As I looked out at the attentive faces, at the nodding heads and furious note-taking, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of completion. The revenge I had so meticulously planned and executed years earlier had served its purpose. It had exposed the truth, prevented further harm to others, and freed me from the prison of my mother's narrative. But the real victory hadn't been in her downfall. It had been in my rise from the ashes of what she had tried to make of me. I thought back to that day in the attic, to the shock and devastation of discovering that my entire life had been shaped by deliberate sabotage. How lost I had felt, how betrayed, how fundamentally destroyed. I remembered the cold fury that had followed, the methodical planning, the satisfaction of watching her carefully constructed facade crumble under the weight of her own documented cruelty. But mostly, I remembered the aftermath, the hard, unglamorous work of rebuilding an authentic self from the wreckage of a false narrative, the therapy sessions where I sobbed until I couldn't breathe, the panic attacks that ambushed me in moments of success, my body still programmed to expect punishment for outshining my mother, the relationships I had to redefine or release as I established healthier boundaries, the days when getting out of bed felt like an impossible achievement, and the days when I surprised myself with newfound strength and clarity. Recovery from narcissistic abuse isn't a straight line, I told the audience, departing from my prepared remarks. It's not a neat before and after story with a clear demarcation between victimhood and healing. It's messy and circular and sometimes feels like you're moving backward even as you're growing. I paused, making eye contact with individuals throughout the room. And that's okay. Healing isn't perfect. It doesn't have to be Instagram-worthy to be real. Some days, survival is enough. Some days, setting one tiny boundary is a massive victory. Some days, recognizing a trigger before it consumes you is progress worth celebrating. After the presentation, a woman approached me, clutching a copy of the book that had evolved from my initial writing project. Now a respected resource on narcissistic abuse recovery, it had helped thousands navigate the complicated terrain of healing. "I just need you to know," she said, voice thick with emotion, "your work saved my life." I was ready to give up, to believe I was as fundamentally flawed as my father always told me I was. "Your story showed me another possibility." As she spoke, I felt something shift inside me, the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. For so many years, I had been defined by what my mother had done to me, first as her victim and then as her exposer. My identity had been reactive, shaped in response to her actions rather than emerging from my own authentic core. But standing there, listening to this stranger describe how my pain had become her pathway to healing, I realized I had finally moved beyond the narrative of narcissistic abuse and revenge. I was no longer Emma Winters, daughter of Diane, survivor of psychological warfare. I was simply Emma, a woman who had transformed personal suffering into collective healing, who had alchemized trauma into purpose. That night, I sat on the balcony of my hotel room, watching the city lights shimmer below. I thought about my mother, somewhere out there in the darkness, still likely spinning stories about her ungrateful daughter, still seeking validation and control, still trapped in the prison of her own narcissism. For the first time, I felt no anger toward her, no vindictive satisfaction in her downfall, no need to guard against her next manipulation. Just a quiet sadness for a woman who would never know the freedom of authentic connection, the joy of celebrating another's success without feeling diminished, the peace of being enough just as she was. I didn't forgive her, not in the conventional sense that implied her actions were somehow excusable or that our relationship could or should be restored. But I had reached a place of indifference that felt like its own kind of freedom. She no longer occupied precious real estate in my mind or heart. She was a closed chapter, a lesson learned, a wound transformed into wisdom. 7 years after finding those journals in a dusty attic, I stood in another attic, this one in the home Eric and I had purchased together after our wedding. Sunlight streamed through clean windows as I organized boxes of memorabilia, photos from our honeymoon, cards from friends celebrating our recent news of expecting our first child, notes from readers whose lives had been changed by the Mirror Project. "Need any help up there?" Eric called from below. "Just finishing up," I replied, sealing the last box with tape. As I turned to leave, my gaze fell on a small box tucked in the corner, unmarked, dusty, almost forgotten. Inside were the journals that had started it all, my mother's meticulous documentation of her psychological warfare. I hadn't looked at them in years, having extracted what was necessary for healing and justice before putting them away. For a moment, I considered opening them again, not from a place of hurt, but from the anthropological curiosity of an archaeologist examining artifacts from a distant civilization. But something stopped me. Those words, those twisted justifications, that calculated cruelty, they were relics of a past that no longer defined me. I closed the box and returned it to its corner. Perhaps someday I would show them to my child when they were old enough to understand the complexities of family dysfunction and the power of breaking generational patterns. Perhaps they would be donated to a research institution studying narcissistic abuse, or perhaps they would simply remain here, gathering dust, gradually losing their power as time covered them with the steady accumulation of new, healthier memories. As I descended the attic stairs, one hand resting protectively on my slightly rounded belly, I felt a profound sense of completion. The cycle of narcissistic abuse that had controlled my family for generations had ended with me. My child would know a different kind of mother, one who celebrated their uniqueness rather than feeling threatened by it, who supported their dreams without sabotaging their efforts, who loved them for who they were rather than for how they reflected on her. "All set?" Eric asked, meeting me at the bottom of the stairs with a glass of water. "All set," I confirmed, taking the glass with a smile. "Just putting some old ghosts to rest." That night, as we sat on our back porch watching fireflies illuminate the summer darkness, I thought about the long, winding path that had led me here. The little girl who had internalized her mother's criticisms as truth. The young woman who had discovered the breathtaking scope of betrayal. The vengeful daughter who had systematically dismantled her abuser's facade. The survivor who had rebuilt herself from the wreckage. The advocate who had transformed personal pain into collective healing. All of these versions of myself existed simultaneously within me, not competing for dominance, but integrated into a complex, authentic whole. The hurt child would always be part of me, as would the righteous avenger. But they no longer controlled the narrative. They were aspects of my story, not its entirety. What my mother never understood, what narcissists fundamentally cannot grasp, is that true identity isn't something static that can be permanently damaged or controlled. It's a living, evolving process of becoming, of integrating experiences both light and dark into a coherent sense of self. By trying to keep me small, she had inadvertently prepared me for this expansion. By forcing me to doubt myself, she had taught me the value of hard-won self-trust. By showing me the damage that narcissism inflicts, she had guided me toward its opposite, a life of authentic connection, mutual support, and genuine purpose. This wasn't the closure I had imagined when I first discovered her journals and began planning my revenge. It was something far more profound, not just the end of her control, but the beginning of my genuine freedom. Not just escape from her narrative, but the creation of my own. I once believed revenge would heal the wounds of decades of narcissistic abuse. I was wrong. Revenge provided justice, accountability, protection for potential future victims. It was necessary and justified. But healing? That came later, through the slow, unglamorous work of therapy, through supportive relationships that gradually replaced toxic patterns, through finding purpose in helping others navigate similar darkness. The most satisfying revenge wasn't exposing my mother's abuse or watching her carefully constructed image crumble. It wasn't even building a successful career or finding authentic love. It was discovering, after years of believing myself fundamentally flawed, that I was whole and worthy all along. That the darkness she had tried to instill in me could be transformed into light for others. That her greatest failure wasn't in losing her reputation or professional standing. It was in failing to crush the resilient spirit that now thrived in her absence. I am Emma Winters. Not the disappointment my mother tried to create, not the victim my records might suggest, not even the avenger who exposed decades of abuse. I am a complex, evolving human being who has learned to transmute pain into purpose, betrayal into wisdom, trauma into healing. That is the story I will pass on to my child. Not a legacy of narcissistic destruction, but a testament to the human capacity for resilience, for growth, for alchemizing the basest experiences into gold. And in that transformation, from controlled to controller, from abused to advocate, from reactive to creative, I have found the truest, most complete revenge, living well, not in spite of what was done to me, but because of what I chose to make of it.